Welcome everyone to the next lecture in our series of lectures about disabilities. This one is about Down syndrome, which is probably a disability that you may be somewhat familiar with. You may have seen movies, TV shows, people in public that have Down syndrome. It's a relatively well-known disability, and we'll go into the details of some strategies that you'll be able to use, as well as treatments and things like that, which you may or may not be familiar with. Okay, so it is the most common genetic condition whereby people have an extra set of chromosomes. People with Down syndrome all share the similar, unique facial features. And you can see a picture of a boy there. And maybe that'll jog your memory a little bit. You will have seen people like that out and about while you were doing the shopping or down at the beach and those types of places. Down syndrome occurs because of a chromosomal abnormality that happens while the cells are pairing and dividing at conception. So it's something that happens early on in life. It's something that people are born with. They don't suddenly develop Down syndrome, like, for example, diabetes, which can occur later in life. And you'll also notice the interesting thing with Down syndrome, is that it's clearly visible. So with ADHD, diabetes, autism in most cases, you can't actually see that the person has ADHD, for example. With Down syndrome, you can clearly walk into a classroom or a childcare centre and you know instantly, as opposed to other disorders and disabilities. So it clearly makes diagnosis a lot easier from your point of view, and it means you can start thinking about with the type of strategies you're going to use and the additional care requirements and those types of things within the first couple of minutes of walking into that class or activity. Now, as I've said with all of these, don't be too concerned with the medical or physiological type issues and what creates Down syndrome from that sort of point of view. What we really want to look at is, okay, what is Down syndrome, a bit of an overview, and then we want to start looking at the strategies. So that's probably the most important thing. And again, the strategies are very, very similar for all disabilities. They're realistically very similar and they have a significant overlap. So as you go through these, you'll get very sick of me saying we need to concentrate on the strategies and systems and processes. But ultimately, if you're working in a special needs centre which has 50 or 60 students that have special needs, then you're not going to be able to come up with 10 strategies for each individual child. You'll actually have a set of stock standard things that you know work, that work with your personality, that work with the behaviour management rules that are set down by the people above you, and the education and behaviour plans that the students are on. So the strategies are especially important if you're working with large volumes of students where you don't have huge amounts of time. As opposed to working in a classroom where you're in a mainstream classroom and you have one particular student that you're assisting who may have autism or something like that. Generally, people have 46 chromosomes in each cell with 22 pairs and 2 sex chromosomes. So that's 22 times 2 gives you 44. Add 2 obviously gives you 46. While the egg begins to divide, each cell divides, and so each cell will have the same genetic code. If the cells do not pair off correctly, an error called non-disjunction occurs. 47 chromosomes are now developing, duplicating itself, and a baby with Down syndrome develops. Now, I'm not an expert in this type of thing, and nor do we expect you guys to be. So if you're not full bottle on that or you don't quite understand it, then I wouldn't be too concerned at this stage anyway. Unless, of course, you were working with people with Down syndrome on a very regular basis, then, of course, you're obviously recommended to go and learn a lot more, do some PDs, some reading, additional research, and that type of stuff. But realistically here, we just cover the very, very basics, just to give you something of an idea. Okay, diagnosis. So prenatal diagnosis, 15 to 20 weeks, the triple screen blood test, ultrasounds, those types of things. Not really that relevant to us at this stage. If a baby is suspected to have a chromosomal abnormality, a blood test analysis is conducted shortly after birth. You guys can read through that stuff in your own time, or just go to Google. Types of Down syndrome. I'm not going to get into the particular details here, but you're certainly welcome to research that in your own time. But I don't think we need to go into that much depth. Most of your assessments, if this is the disability that you're concentrating on, then they certainly don't expect you to have anywhere near that level of understanding. Common facial characteristics. Now, obviously, you can see the picture of the girl, and we saw a picture of the boy earlier on. They do have and share very common facial characteristics. You can spot them a while away, which does make your life a lot easier if you're working in a school and you're working between 15 classes. And sometimes we have, like in a school, you may be a floater where you're just being used in different classrooms wherever there is a need. So obviously working closely with kids with ADHD can be a little harder to spot because there's no obvious facial characteristics. But in this case, there's really no question about whether a person has Down syndrome or not. The eyes, the epicanthal fold, the eyes that have a slant and an extra fold of skin on the inner side. Ears can be smaller, and the tops may fold slightly over and sit lower on the face. Smaller, flatter nose, broader face, a thicker neck or extra fold of skin, brush-filled spots, which are small white flecks on their iris. Now, a lot of disabilities do have common characteristics. When we get to fetal alcohol syndrome later on, for example, there are common characteristics, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to have all of those characteristics. They don't need to have all of those specific facial features, for example, in order to be diagnosed as having that particular disorder, but it is common to most children. Most children who would fit into that category, sorry. Common physical characteristics. Again, we're continuing on from the last slide, which was really showing us the face type characteristics. Smaller and or shorter limbs, and smaller and chubbier fingers. Transverse palmar crease, single crease across the broader hand with a pinky that may appear crooked. Low muscle tone and loose ligaments. Big toes, widely spaced. Congenital heart defects found in about 50% of people from before birth. Range of associated medical conditions including vision and hearing problems, reduced immune function. Now, we do talk about this in this lecture, about the vision and hearing problems, and I really will be brushing over it quite quickly because there is a separate lecture about vision and hearing problems. And again, you may have noticed that with a lot of disabilities, I always mention multiple disabilities because it's very important to recognize the fact that if you're working with a kid that has Down syndrome, quite often they will have other disabilities that are related or that have an impact on what you're trying to do with them, on their learning and that kind of thing. So it's worth bearing in mind that you come up with these strategies for Down syndrome, but hang on, wait a minute, do they actually have other issues as well that you'll need to address, such as vision problems and so forth? Okay, some of the facts. It was once considered a high social status to have a child with Down syndrome. Young mothers can have a child with Down syndrome. It's not so much a matter of age of the mother, but the health of her eggs. And this stuff's not really important for us as far as working in schools. You can go to Wikipedia and look up Down syndrome if you like later on. 1 in 1,100 Australian babies, approximately, is born with Down syndrome. 13,000 people in Australia. 270 babies a year. In WA, most babies born with Down syndrome are referred to the Disability Service Commission to have an individual and family services program developed. Now, these little terminology, these little things, your acronym IFSP, now don't be surprised if that changes depending on how long after I made this lecture you're watching it. In my experience, especially in dealing with education and disability services and stuff like that, there's always acronyms that continue to change, and it seems that every time I'm talking to a teacher at EI or something like that, there's a bunch of new acronyms that I've never heard of before, new programs coming out, new government funding comes and then disappears, and a new program replaces it with different acronyms. So don't be too concerned if that changes and it's called something different with the NDIS. It might change that again. Provide support for infants and young children with development delays or disabilities. We're talking about early intervention here. Occupational therapy, speech therapy, physiotherapy. Not something we really need to get into. If you're not sure about any of those terms, feel free to Google it. If it is expected child by 5, so obviously depending on other disabilities, but developmentally, which means growing and learning new skills and physically being able to do new things. By the age of 5, they should be walking, be toilet trained, dressed with minimal help, and be able to feed themselves. Yeah, we're right. Okay, and again, we've covered these in previous lectures, the different types of visual cues, and again, visual cues are very, very important for people with disabilities for the most part. Autism, ADHD, kids in general, and especially these days because people are very much visual learners. Children, for example, are extremely good and extremely well trained at learning from a screen. So helping kids use their those existing skills and abilities that they practice all the time, being able to give them a simple instruction by pointing to a picture on the wall, for example, is extremely important and can certainly help you as well. Visual learners focus on using visual processing and visual memory skills. So when I talk about processing here, processing is all about being able to interpret and make sense of the information that the person is actually seeing. Because while a person with a disability may be able to see something, so they may be able to see a pencil case, they may not be able to in their brain process exactly what they're looking at. And I'm not talking about Down syndrome specifically, but that's a basic example of what we mean by processing. So we also talk about different types of sensory processing disorder, for example. Now, your processing is all about the brain side of it, because being able to see something, hear something, touch something is only part of the process of being able to make sense of what's around you and what's going on. More is understood than is said. So now that basically means that there are possibly language issues there, and I suppose the term you would use there is articulation. So being able to express what you want and what you need or what they're thinking is sometimes a problem, and that's with all children, but especially so with children with disabilities. So and that comes, for example, as well as if you ever learnt a second language. You notice that in your head you might be thinking, I want to ask this person if I can buy this particular thing, but you won't know how to say it in words. So that's one way that we could explain what we mean by that dot point there. Classroom rules and behaviours can be followed. Structures and routine are super important, and that goes without saying, I think, for all children, but it's especially worth taking the time to think about structures and routines with students with disabilities. Use shorter phrases and visual cues. So, for example, you will see teachers stand up, or EAs working with kids, and they'll give long-winded instructions that take 10 minutes to explain, and then kids are sitting there and they'll forget 2 or 3 things. Well, try breaking things down for them. So assisting them by writing down 5 dot points that they need to do, for example. A little bit more structure there, a little bit more Scaffolding and assistance is quite important. So shorter phrases, short, sharp sentences, and visual cues or clues. So there's those examples of some visual cues over on the left-hand side there. Keep the expectation for behaviour and attitude high, as with any other child. And again, but that will obviously depend on the child. But interesting, it depends on your expectation level and where the child is when you first start working with them. But quite often people will lift their game to meet your expectations, especially if you've got a good rapport with them. Okay, curriculum needs. So this is about the education side of stuff, about what they're learning. Social skills is important. One-to-one teaching, small group work as well, and possible, I mean, I shouldn't even say possible there, but just whole class instruction. So it's important to do a variety of methods. And as an example, if you're working with a student with Down syndrome, one-on-one, all day, every day, 5 days a week, I would be recommending not sitting next to them and sort of being in their face the whole time. You'd want to get up and you'd want to move around the room, you'd want to assist other students, unless there was serious behavioural problems. And it's important for all students to learn to be independent, to work on their own, to work quietly, to concentrate, to work with another person, to work with one of their peers, to work in a small group of 2 or 3, to sit there quietly and listen and follow what the whole class is doing. So, for example, during silent reading. Functional skills are a priority. So that's life skills. That's being able to do things like go to the toilet, possibly iron clothes, depending on how old they are, if they're at high school, for example. Being able to purchase products, being able to cook things, those types of things. So being able to function in the real world. And here's some examples taken off a jumper. Recognising correct toilets procedures, or the male and female toilets. Eating lunch and recess at the correct time. So being able to have those skills to control themselves so that they can continue to concentrate on doing something even though they're hungry. Contingency plan for accidents in regards to toileting. So again, having a plan, having a system in place is very important. If the student needs it, it depends on the age and the student's needs, obviously. And repetition of activities is valuable. And again, that goes with every student. A routine, we're talking about routines again. But for example, if you were learning how to do a certain functional skill, like taking off a jumper, as the example is over there, repeating that activity every day, even in summer when it's a little bit hot. But if that's a skill that you decided that you want to teach them, then repeating that activity over and over again is important. I think that goes without saying. Modified curriculum. So if you're working with a student one-on-one, that generally means they need additional support. So you're looking at things like scaffolding, learning styles, so forth. How may you act if? So how may you act if you were being told to do something that you were unsure of? So we're talking about learning disorders here. Your language skills were not developed enough to express your concerns and views, and we see that in adults as well. I mean, even at the Cert 3 and the Cert 4 courses with people that are have lots of experience in education or childcare, for example, they're enrolling in courses and they may know the answers and verbally they can articulate the answers but can't write it down. I really struggle to put it on paper, and they take a long time to hand assessments and things like that, and even though in their head they know the answer. So sometimes we've got different levels of abilities depending on the different requirements of the task and what type of language we're using, because our verbal language we use is a completely different language to how we think in our head, to how we write, to how we speak and so forth. Children with DS-like structure. That goes with all children, I would say. Refusal can occur when trying to get the child to try new things. Again, that goes with all children, but specifically with Down syndrome. This is because they resort to doing what they know is safe. Again, that's an aspect of all people, not just necessarily people with Down syndrome and people with disabilities. But again, with people with disabilities, you really want to be thinking about routines. And anytime things are changed, especially if there's no notice given, then there's a potential for problems and issues there. Okay, now stubbornness. If you're not sure what that word stubbornness is, please look it up. It's relatively important. But you can draw your own conclusions on that. Again, I think it depends on the individual person and your relationship with them and the type of activities you're doing. Prepare the child for change. So, for example, if they're very used to doing the same thing every day, music class at the same time, if you know on Friday that there's something different, you're going to have a different teacher for music class, make sure they know and remind them so that when it does happen, it's not such a shock, which can, of course, lead to outbursts of anger and things like that. Discuss the upcoming changes. Help the child feel safe within your activity. So fading prompting, for example, is a very common strategy used. That basically means that to begin with, you may help someone a lot with the task. You may show them how to do the task, and you'll slowly fade away so that into the background so that they can then eventually do the task completely independently. It's very similar to the levels of instruction that we cover in some of our courses, depending on which course you're doing. That fading prompting is another strategy that's sort of related to that. And as an example, if you were teaching someone a new skill like how to make a sandwich, to begin with, you may make it for them and show them how to do it and explain it and spend 5 or 10 minutes doing that. And over time, then the next thing you might do is get them to do each little bit themselves one at a time, and you may help them, you may watch them, you may do the harder parts for them, those types of things. And then you may eventually get to a stage where they're making it completely on your own, and all you have to do is say, Peter, go and make me a sandwich, please. Or let's try today. What we're going to practice is making a ham, polony, and tomato sandwich, and then they can go off and do that. So you started off being sort of in their face, I guess you could say, to eventually them being very independent. Social stories. We've covered that quite in depth in probably the last 5 lectures. If you're not sure what social stories are, they're basically well, I'll go back and watch the first few lectures, especially the one about autism. We cover that for about 10 or 15 minutes. And behaviour management, black and white rules. Now, of course, I mean, simplistically we would say there are black and white rules, but in reality, I think it's very, very difficult to have black and white rules. I think it depends on the situation. I think it depends if it's Friday afternoon. I think it depends if it's Monday morning. I think there's a whole range of other factors. Now, children are very understanding that some kids have special rules or unwritten rules that only apply to them. So now, even if they don't have disabilities, even if that child doesn't have a disability. So, for example, if you're trying to get a group of 5 or 6 students or kids in a childcare centre, if you're trying to get them to, say, read a book silently. Now, there's one particular student who not quite refuses to, but has a lot of difficulties reading silently, but you can get them to concentrate for 10 minutes and then they might get off task, and then you go sit with them and you read for them a little bit, and then they concentrate for another 5 or 10 minutes. Students are and they don't necessarily get in trouble for that, but that's a lot better than what they normally do. Normally they can barely concentrate for 2 minutes. Now, if, for example, another student who always concentrates really well is off task and continuing to talk, they may get in trouble, and there may be a consequence, such as missing out on something later on. Now, children are very understanding that different rules do apply to different people. So to say that this one rule applies in a black and white sense to every student or every child is not, in reality, how things actually work. Because as adults, we bend rules all the time. Developmentally, we bend rules all the time for the children in our care. Developmentally appropriate consequences. So what that basically means is having a fair and logical consequence to the behaviour. So again, in the example I was just using, if you've got a child who rarely concentrates, who's really struggling, who needs that one-on-one support, but they do 10 minutes of quiet work, then you may not have a consequence if they get up and they walk around the room and then sit back down and continue, because for them they've actually been behaving quite well. But another student, if they do, then there might be a consequence for that particular student who typically doesn't misbehave as often. And of course, in childcare, we don't use the word misbehave. In childcare, they use the word guiding behaviour, which effectively, for the sake of this lecture, is pretty much the same thing, with a slightly more positive tone. Structure is very important. Inform student that you are displeased with by using your voice and your body language. So you've got those basic bump 1 and bump 2 type things. Read through the lectures there. Have a look at those lectures there, the bump 1, bump 2 type stuff. Very, very important cornerstone of behaviour management. Explicit and clear expectations. Catch the student being good. Positive reinforcement, that's called. Consistency and follow through. So there's no point in having consequences if you're not going to follow through, because kids very, very quickly work out that 50% of the time you can't be bothered enforcing a rule. Then they very quickly decide not to bother following the rules. So it's important that if you do have a rule in place, that if you do this, then I'm going to keep you back at recess for a minute or 5 minutes, even if you don't have time to keep them back for recess for 5 minutes. Make sure you at least have a chat to them for 30 seconds and let them know, I haven't forgotten, there is a consequence, but today I'll let you off because you were really good all day, and you've done all your work, and I've got something that I need to attend to real quickly, like recess duty or something like that. Okay, so even if you can't follow through on the consequence, make sure you at least let the student know that you otherwise would have. Strategies to alleviate resistance to change, again, with adults as well. People hate change. People hate leaving one job and going to a next job. It's a huge, upsetting, emotional time, and people with disabilities even more so, because it takes them a lot longer to master things, it takes them a lot longer to make friends, and when they get into a routine and they feel safe, and then you suddenly say, we're changing that routine today and there's no particular reason for it, we're just doing it, you could come across some resistance to change there. Okay, types of physical and medical conditions. We'll go through this pretty quick. This is obviously related to Down syndrome, hearing problems, eyesight, immune system issues, heart defects, and gross and fine motor skills. So for those that aren't aware of the difference between gross and fine motor, gross is using, in simplistic terms, gross is using big limbs, so throwing a basketball, those types of stuff. And fine motor is little things, so being able to hold a pen, fold paper, those types of things. Specific learning difficulties. Speech and language was the last one that popped up there. Communication strategies. Have a visual cue card for the child to point to when communicating. That's a very, very common strategy that's being used. And again, remember all the different strategies that we spoke about in the other lectures as well, because quite often they work across the board. Read through the behaviour management chapter in your course and have a look at all the strategies that are being used there. Now, quite often those strategies that we outline aren't specifically for people with Down syndrome, or they're not for people, children with disabilities, but they work across the board. And I'd be hesitant to say that this strategy works with children with Down syndrome, and that strategy works with children with ADHD, because the strategies all need adjusting. You might want to combine strategies, you might want to use it for a little bit, and then it suddenly stops working. So it's important to try a variety of strategies. Ask a child to show what they want. Again, we're talking about not being able to communicate using words what they actually want, which can obviously cause frustration and outbursts and things like that. Teach hand gestures for the child to use when communicating. Makaton is useful. There's several different. So Makaton is sort of like, how you've got sign language, like Auslan. Makaton is a very basic version of that, and there's different variants depending on which school you're at. Having higher receptive or understanding skills than expressive skills, frustration can easily occur when not understood. So don't be confused here. When it says receptive skills, that's the same as, for example, if you were learning a second language, you can quite often understand what people are saying, or the majority of what people are saying, but it doesn't mean you can speak back to them, because you've got issues with grammar and not knowing the exact word and things like that. So what that basically means is they can understand more, they can understand a lot of what you say, but they may not be able to express themselves to that same level. Give clear and simple instructions, use eye contact, encourage lots of speech and sound. Spend at least 5 minutes a day talking with the student. That seems quite low. Well, it depends on if you're working with them all day and you only spend 5 minutes talking with them, that would probably be a problem. I'm always of the opinion that rapport building, which is getting to know people, getting them on your side, is so important, especially with students with disabilities. And you should spend way more than 5 minutes a day, I would think. But I usually make a point to circulate in the class and to spend a couple of minutes with each student, asking them things like, what did you do on the weekend? Or just ask at least something. And then a week later, if you're circulating again, try and remember what they said. So that they said they played football on the weekend, ask them, did you go and play football again? And those rapport building skills are very important. And you'll find that staff in childcare centres and in schools who have the best behaviour control, who have students and children who misbehave the least, they're working really hard with rapport. Because people tend not to misbehave or tend to try and they tend not to misbehave if they have respect for you, and they also tend to try and impress people that they like. So that's a natural human instinct. So if you can get people on side, and it means that you can simply, if they're having a bad day and they're off with the fairies or they're having a temper tantrum, quite often you'll find you might come across a situation where a new EA is there and the child is seemingly uncontrollable, and then when you walk up and say, come down, let's go for a walk, you go for a walk for a bit, the student comes down straight away, problem solved. And that's because of rapport. So it's extremely important. Make sure you're always thinking about building rapport with students. Do lots of reading activities. This builds a knowledge base for when speech communication improves. So again, concentrating on language skills is very important. Okay, hearing implications. We'll get through this pretty quick. Delayed speech and language development. So just to explain that, if anyone's confused, what we mean by delayed speech and language development. So development means that you get better at something as time goes on, right? In simplistic terms. So, and again, I'm being super simplistic here, but if you have a child that is, say, 13 years of age, their language level might not be the same as other 13-year-olds. It might be as an 11-year-old, or it might be as a 6-year-old. So that's what we mean by delayed. So it's not non-existent, it's just a few years behind. Students may not notice instructions being given in a noisy classroom. Hearing infections, loss of hearing can be up to 40 decibels in one day, and a playground siren might not be heard. And I don't know how to pronounce that word, hyperacusis, oversensitivity to loud noises. Okay, and you notice that word there, hyper, H-Y-P-E-R. Remember in the diabetes we were talking about hypo. So as far as improving your own vocabulary goes, hypo, as in hypothermia, means to be lower than a certain level. So hypothermia means colder, your body temperature is dropping. Hyperthermia means your body temperature is above the normal. So hyper there obviously means above. Possible refusal to join noisy situations such as assembly, which relates to number 4 above it. Frequent colds and upper respiratory infections and small ear canal infections can cause varying degrees of hearing loss. That picture there seems to pop up quite regularly, doesn't it? Hearing strategies. Sit student closer to the teacher and not looking into bright light. Goes with all students really, as far as looking at bright light, I would assume. Face-to-face interactions. So a lot of one-on-one stuff, a lot of direct talking, one-on-one, facing the person, letting them clearly know that you're the one they're addressing. Clear language suited for developmental level of the child. So, and that's something to be aware of, because I think that happens quite regularly, where one person is talking to another and the language used by one is just a bit too difficult or a bit long-winded. So be aware of the level of language that you're using. Can you break it down? Can you dumb down the instructions even further into smaller, tiny little steps, little baby steps? Visual cues and signing. So signing is, we spoke about Makaton earlier. Reduce background noise or move student to a quieter part of the room. Use headphones. Again, it would depend on the individual student, but these are just a range of strategies that may or may not work. So really think about the needs of the individual student. I'll just bring up a few of these. Okay, behaviours to watch for. Tilting head. This is for eyesight. Tilting head too far back, working too close to a book. Now, I mean, a lot of students, you will notice that they've got behaviour problems straight away. I mean, sometimes you'll notice that they even develop, eyesight problems, because they'll develop those problems, what would almost seem suddenly, but some of them go undiagnosed for a while until someone at a school or childcare centre notices it. So you'll pick up little things like they'll read really closely to a screen, or they'll look really closely at a book and they'll be inches away from it. Sit really, really close to a TV. They may squint lots. Okay, so if you see that type of thing, then start thinking, well, is it an eyesight issue? Has the child forgotten their glasses? Do they have the wrong type of glasses? Do they need stronger ones? Impaired vision is very common, very sensitive to sun exposure. Regular eye checks are needed. Now, sitting positions. So, as I said in a previous lecture, quite often the teachers or the directors of childcare centres and things like that are very, very busy. They're running around doing hundreds of things. So don't be afraid to say, well, okay, let's go sit up the front, or let's move up the front while the teacher's delivering something on the board, or if it's an assembly or an activity or something like that. Ensure glasses are worn, hats and sunglasses outside. There can be issues with the gradual deterioration of eye tissue. Okay, the immune system, which is what fights off diseases and bad bugs and things like that. Let's go back one. Okay, so an underdeveloped immune system is common, so that means that their system, their body, isn't as strong as most people would be as far as fighting off bacteria and colds and flus and things like that. So it might take them a lot longer to get over the flu. If they do catch it, it can be a lot more severe, and they may catch it a lot more regularly. Illness such as upper respiratory infections are more common. Frequent use of antibiotics may affect toileting. Alrighty, implications and strategies. Heart defects is what we're talking about on this particular slide. Heart defects, 40% of students with Down syndrome have heart defects, which is actually quite high. And they are operable, so sometimes those defects can be operated on. A pigeon chest is no need for concern. Oh, yeah. So because of obviously the issue with the heart and blood flow through the body and whatnot, people with Down syndrome may become tired a lot more easily. Some physical activities can be harder for full participation, such as long distance running, for example. Current medical information, if you can get hold of it, if you're in charge of making sure that a particular person with Down syndrome is having a safe day, and if you're taking them out for sport and things like that, then obviously trying to find the latest medical information, talking to parents, those kind of things is probably important. Monitor physical activities and allow students to sit down when required, so taking particular notice, as with all disabilities, but especially being aware that heart defects are common, which obviously has implications for exercise. Gross motor skills. So again, gross motor skills are the big motor skills. So that's for throwing a basketball, running, jumping, things like that. Things you may notice: floppy and loose jointed. Difficulties with coordination and gait. So gait sort of means walking. Difficulty problem solving when using equipment. Poor motor planning, poor muscle tone. May have less stamina than their peers. So that means they might not be able to exercise for as long without getting tired. It's important to encourage participation and make games friendly. So user friendly, and that may mean adjusting the rules a little bit. That may mean that if you're, for example, playing cricket, that you still give them the opportunity to bat, and you're not letting other students throw the ball at them 100 k's an hour. Of course, it depends on the person. Model and talk the student through the problem, so helping them solve the particular problem. So if they're having issues with hitting a ball with a cricket bat, then showing them, modelling, spending a bit of extra time, even if it's to the side while the rest of the kids are playing, a bit of extra practice the day before, those types of things. Assist a child verbally and physically while gaining confidence with play equipment. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Ensure orthotic devices are in the correct shoe. So obviously they're I'm not sure what they're made out of, the cushioning plastic stuff that goes in each shoe if a person is flat-footed or has some other problem with their feet. So you've just got to make sure that obviously the left is in the left shoe, the right's in the right foot shoe, and that they're actually using it. They're not sitting in their bag somewhere. Some kids might get embarrassed, for example. Fine motor skills, strategies and implications. Poor dexterity and manipulation skills. So that basically means poor fine motor skills. So that's the ability to manipulate small objects like drawing and knitting and things like that, cutting up stuff. Songs and games that develop muscle strength in arms, wrist, hands and fingers and pitches, and childcare centres and kindies and stuff like that are particularly good at that. They do that a lot without even knowing they're doing it, or without specifically for Down syndrome, kids with Down syndrome. But so Incy Wincy Spider, for example, is a perfect example there. Key Steps program. Feel free to Google that. I'm not very familiar with it. Okay. Difficulty cutting and handwriting. So we've been through that. Duty of care. Yeah, if you're not familiar with duty of care, please go back and read the first chapter, the safety chapter, and make sure you're very aware of what duty of care is. It's very important. High level of supervision in areas of risk. So, for example, if you're going swimming or something like that. Toilet procedures, made an extra monitoring. Response plan if student leaves the school grounds. Now that happens all the time with kids with autism. Some kids run away almost daily, and they'll hide under demountables, or they'll run down the street and run away. And so again, it's best to have a strategy and a plan in place for what exactly you do if that happens. And in my experience, for example, if a child does run away, usually it's up to the EA to chase them down and bring them back to the school. And sometimes if they refuse to come back, what the EA would do is just stand at the corner of the road and just watch the student from, say, 50 to 100 metres away, just to make sure they're okay. I mean, you can't chase them up and down the suburbs, so but standing there and waiting for them to come back, and eventually quite often they'll come back when they calm down. But of course, there usually are strategies in place, and one important part of that would be getting the line manager or the deputy or something like that, and at least informing them, and then you've sort of passed on your duty of care in a way. Certainly in those type of situations, you wouldn't want to be handling the situation yourself, because you've obviously, or on your own anyway, because obviously you've got some kids get quite big. I mean, they might be in year 7, year 8, even the younger kids can be 5.5 feet tall, quite strong. So if something happens, if they decide they're in a really bad mood, then you could be in a bit of trouble there. So having a bit of backup is always important. Some schools carry walkie-talkies, for example. A little bit more difficult in a childcare centre for people to run away, but obviously having systems in place for when students do refuse to engage in activities or are in those types of moods is very important. Poor understanding of boundaries and other concepts, showing exactly when and where the student can play is very important, timing it, having playtime as a reward, but making sure there are boundaries within where they can go and what they can do, and how long they're allowed to play for, because some kids will literally want to play for hours and hours on end, and won't ever seem to get tired. So, and will get very, very cranky and upset if you try to pull them off the play equipment. So, having very structured rules around the fact that there is an expectation that you're allowed to play, but only for a certain period of time, and then we have to get some work done or move on to a different activity. Protective behaviours program, that's about mainly talking about, you might have heard of the circle concept. So that teaches kids who's allowed to touch them and where they're allowed to be touched, and they have different circles where you've got your inner circle and outer circle, and strangers are only allowed to get so close and all this type of stuff. Because there are, I don't know this off the top of my head, but there are a lot of statistics out there that show that people with disabilities are at a significantly greater risk of being abused, sexually abused, those types of things. Mandatory reporting underneath that. Swimming lessons, does the student need earplugs? Can they hear you with a swim cap? Extra supervision in bathrooms, assistance with clothing. The buddy system works well. Monitor and remind students about weather needs such as jumpers, hats, sunscreen, those types of things. And again, this is just a small sample of the different types of strategies and things for you to start thinking about. But most importantly, once you've worked with the child for a few days, really sitting down and thinking, even if it's just on your way home, you've got a half-hour drive to get home, just thinking about the types of strategies that are important for that particular child. Alrighty, and that's it. There's a few websites there, quite a few in fact, downsyndrome.org.au. For those that aren't aware, org means organisation. It usually means it's some type of charity. I would encourage people quite often for this type of research to use .org and .gov sites. And you can certainly type into Google Down syndrome, .org/.gov, and it'll come up with quite a few. Because quite often the government, for example, have websites which are full of information like this for parents and schools and stuff like that. Also, the Department of Education in the state that you're in will have a lot of information generally on their website. So if you go type in, in WA, for example, it's if you type in Department of Education / WA Down syndrome, you should come up with quite a lot of stuff.